Ooh, welcome to the Doctor Who Review Guide's spooky Halloween special. And we start with the most bone-chillingly terrifying news of all. RTD2 Doctor Who is returning at Christmas 2026. Ah! Alright, I won't do the voice anymore, mostly because I don't actually like Halloween very much. I find it tacky and annoying, but yes, this is indeed the Halloween special. Last year I viewed a terrifyingly bad episode in Love and Monsters, and while I could have continued that theme, I decided instead to be a little more traditional and focus on an episode with a Halloweeny theme, and, well, ghosts are Halloweeny, aren't they? So here we are. So yes, the Unquiet Dead. This is NuWho's third ever episode, and the other reason I'm covering it is so I can continue powering through the Ninth Doctor, so when I get to the Parting of the Ways, it can be the last story of his I cover. It's an interesting episode, this. It had an important job to do, in that the first two episodes were in a lot of ways just setting up the concepts, the universe, reintroducing everyone to the show, both for its ideas and its storytelling. But this episode had to actually start giving us good Doctor Who stories, free of the trappings now the audience do get the general idea of what the show's about. The episode ends up doing that pretty well, as it's actually pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's overall a satisfying and thorough piece. Solid ideas, story, pacing and character work. It's definitely a great episode, and one I think that it certainly did its job in presenting to the audience what Doctor Who is like. It's funny because the only places it trips up, so when it actually does have to properly tell its story, there's a lot of bizarre and illogical hiccups that just leave me a tad unsatisfied at certain points, which is one of its biggest issues. But on the other hand, it has a great gothic tone, a clear and successful homage to the Hinchcliffe era in many ways, but with enough difference to still feel unique, and introduces the concept, the idea of the Doctor meeting historical figures, something which wasn't actually all that common in the classic series outside the first Doctor's era, and it introduces that to this new audience and does so in a way that keeps that historical figure grounded and feeling like a properly fresh, fleshed out character. It also has well the regulars and the other main guest character, and it has subtlety and skill that's not usually NuWho's strength when it does it, so yeah, overall it's an effective episode and one I honestly found more enjoyable than I expected to. So, if you want to skip the next 20 minutes or so of waffle from me, there's your TLDR. But first, let's talk Doctor Who and horror. Because this is Halloween after all, and this episode is one with a more gothic-inspired tone and with the ghosts and the walking undead as the key concept of the monster, it seems like a good time to quickly examine this. The problem is it's kind of only really in theory though. I actually think this episode's other major issue, other than the one I mentioned, is that it doesn't feel as creepy as it should, and the villains in particular just feel quite generic and doesn't have much fear factor to them. A lot of this will be dated effects, as the CGI is pretty silly looking now, so throwing in with the wobbly cardboard costumes of the classic series inverts stuff kids found scary at the time that now looks silly pile, but I think it's a bit more than that. The focus feels wrong and the portrayal as a whole feels uneven. They're not given the time or opportunity to be particularly creepy. So it's worth examining briefly what this actually means in Doctor Who, because, let's be honest, for all the talk within popular culture of the show being scary, it's never actually been scary. To kids, yeah, but kids are idiot. You'd scare most kids with a stiff breeze. But to anyone who is old enough to get married, the show is never actually going to be scary, and therefore the show sort of gets held to an unrealistic expectation and warps discussion. Everyone expects it, nobody actually experiences it. But it can do creepy and unsettling very well if it wants to, though. Having the aura of scares, or having actually achieved the scares, that is well beyond the show's provenance as a family show, and indeed its budget most of the time as well. Take the Hinchcliffe era, from, as I said earlier, this episode clearly takes at least a bit of inspiration, and while the Sutek or the Morbius creature, they don't look scary, with effective presentation and grounding in the story which they have, then they have a certain power and eeriness that gives the audience that creepy feeling. This episode doesn't really manage that. The combination of the effects having to age poorly, so the elf look like floating blue CGI, not a real creature, and the fact they don't really have all that much depth to them. Their motivations are basic and confused, the threat they pose is in the larger generic sense, to take over the world. And in the personal sense, it's pretty silly, as the corpses literally make zombie noises. Overall, it's not really all that effective, and it's fortunate the strength of the human drama elevates the surrounding material. A very good example of Doctor Who getting this right comes later in this very series, and yes, that is ice spreading through hell. I am about to praise Stephen Moffat. In The Empty Child two-parter, you had a monster that was genuinely very creepy and unnerving, and that was because it did have a very unique presentation and manner, but also because of both the mystery and the human element in its backstory. It didn't feel at all generic, it felt creative and interesting, and that uniqueness helped the creepiness, and it was backed up by real depth to make it feel like a proper story. The Gelf just don't really have that in this, and well, I already spoke about why, but In that story is how you make a properly creepy Doctor Who monster. It takes more than just the surface visuals and styling to do it properly. Ghosts in some spooky setting doesn't cut it, and unfortunately, it is one of the episode's two big problems, and that's a problem because it's one of its main selling points. And I know I sound like a bit of a hypocrite here, given the criticism I have for the catchphrase villain, and the Empty Child basically started that, but it was, in that moment, extremely effective, and it's not here. So that's a negative, but let's start a look at the episode proper, and here there'll be much more positive things to say. Starting with production, this episode was directed by Euros Lyn, a director who we have spoken about many a time before. Indeed, if you're watching this in broadcast order rather than in the order I made these videos, you'll have heard me talking about him in the very previous episode. He's a director who tended to be rather creative, to put it generously, and very over the top, to not put it generously. But in this episode he's actually pretty restrained, and therefore it's one of his better jobs, and overall very much a good one. The episode is paced fantastically, he never lets it slow down to boredom, but also prevents it rushing even at times when the script makes it seem like it probably should. His use of quite dynamic sweeping shots at times is very effective, and coupled with some good camera angles as well, and his choice to keep the scenes with human drama quite tight and close up is an excellent one. We really get a sense of the relationship building between Rose and Gwyneth. Obviously the words are there on the page for it, but Lyn does an excellent job of highlighting the relationship on the screen, so we see it as well as hear it, and helping build the effectiveness of her eventual sacrifice. I think the only parts where Lyn isn't as effective is with the threat of the Gelf, but as I spent some time talking about just now, I think a lot of that was conception and story, and the CGI did the rest. Maybe Lyn could have had them a little more shrouded in mystery, certainly at the start, but in the end I think he was lumbered with concepts that were just going to be difficult to get to properly work. Overall though, he does a good job here and takes a good episode and does elevate it further, which is, given how I criticised him before, not all that usual for him, but never mind. As for the rest of the production, there's not too much to say other than it's a pretty typical Series 1 production. The scope is clearly much lower than the show would get once its success had been established. The Cardiff streets dressed up as 1869 is not going to fool anyone. I've already talked about the CGI, and the music sounds far more artificial and, well, ineffective than it would in the future, but these are all things you have to forgive given where the show was at the time. There's nothing like egregious, so while it's not the most impressive story to look at, there's nothing that's going to drag the story down. Which does bring us to the script. This episode was written by Mark Gatiss. I still haven't worked out how to pronounce his name. I think that's how it is. Anyway, Mark here is probably someone you're all aware of, and I have to say his overall list of contributions to the series is not brilliant. The Idiot's Lantern, Victory of the Daleks, Sleep No More, those are all pretty awful episodes, so I'm afraid he's not someone who I think is a particularly good writer of the show. But also sometimes he could do alright, and this on balance is probably his strongest script for the series. I'll start though by examining the other bigger issue I have with the episode, and that's that the structure and plot beats are sometimes pretty weak. Much of the story relies on quite weak plotting and dubious logic. It's doubly frustrating given the strength of much of the character work that for the actual story would tend to rely on exposition, and not particularly strong exposition at that. A lot of the logic is extremely dubious, as I said, most notably at the ending where it turns out gas is the Gelf's weakness. Well, that doesn't make any sense. If you're going to portray them as basically living flames, why would gas be a weakness? The explanation for why is pretty pathetically tossed off, and I still don't really make any sense. I can't even begin to explain it because I don't understand. It's literally just, it exists, and that's it. And this all leaves the whole ending feeling a bit lame, frankly. This is the best they could come up with. I feel like Gatiss perhaps wrote himself into a corner and came up with what he could think of that Dickens could use to save the day. It makes no sense, and that's just the most prominent example I'm choosing. As I already said, the villains are pretty weak. The idea is very good. I like the idea of sort of non-corporeal aliens, and it is probably an effective departure away from the bubble-wrap monster that was in the average reviewer's mind of what the classic series was. But the actual execution is not brilliant. The motivations are confused and generic. They initially are, oh, poor us, help us, and then eventually end up with, ha ha ha, we're evil and want to take over the world, and that's about it really. There's no particularly deeper meaning to either of those states, nor anything to particularly link them together. They were just stinking liars the whole time, which frankly cheapens the Time War connection they mentioned, which is a pretty important part of the Doctor's motivations for acting as he does. I mean, don't get me wrong, the transition into evil is a good thing and is an important part of the story, but the fact it's just handled so suddenly and clumsily is what cheapens it there. I mean, for all we know, the Time War stuff could be true, but we don't get a sense of how that's motivating them into desperation, or if it is a lie, what that means for the Doctor. It's unexplored and generic, and it's annoying because it didn't actually need very much, just a few lines here and there. And I feel maybe the silly zombies could have been trimmed just a tad if you really needed more room. Anyway, let's start looking at what I do like, and for an episode I think it's pretty good. I've been fairly negative so far, so let's rectify that. Firstly, I remember reading in an old Doctor Who magazine that the original title for this episode was The Name's Dickens, Charles Dickens, which is such an absolutely hilariously terrible title that I'm kind of annoyed they didn't use it, because it would have been memorably awful rather than the pretty silly and forgettable title the episode actually does have. This is my segue into talking about Dickens, in case you haven't guessed, and yes, one of this episode's main features is the inclusion of a historical figure, in this case Victorian author Charles Dickens, who is of course behind many historical classics like Great Expectations and The Tale of Two Cities.
It was the best of times, it was the blurst of times, you stupid monkey!
See, such a literary genius. Anyway, his inclusion here is an interesting standard that was set, but as I said at the start, the inclusion of historical figures was not a standard in the classic series by any stretch of the imagination. It happened a lot in the first Doctor era with the historicals, but other than that, there were a couple of instances in the 6th and 7th Doctor's eras when that was pretty much it. Famously, they avoided Leonardo da Vinci far more than they actually met anyone like him. So deciding to start off NuWho setting this precedent was a bold move, and arguably one that probably became a little more common than it needed to be as diminishing returns took over. Although with how common it has been, it has peaked and troughed. In any case, this was an interesting move, and one I think that for this episode it definitely paid off. The advantages are obvious: have a figure the audience would recognise and show the potential of the time travel setup. The former leads to identification with an audience is still going to be a little wary and confused with the show's entire premise, as this is only the 3rd episode, and the latter means that we show off more of what this show is about and can do. And I think Dickens is a good choice. Everyone's probably heard of at least one story of his, and he's a figure that can be explored pretty uncontroversially. You don't have to bring any politics or anything into it, which would have been unwise at this stage in the show's run, so you won't be pissing anyone off. His character here is helped enormously by two things. Firstly, they don't overdo it. They don't have him go around just talking endlessly about his books and constantly reminding the audience of all those famous things he wrote. Arguably, this is the mistake made with the Shakespeare episode a few years later, when it became about his works rather than the man. Instead, they explore him as a person, both reacting naturally as anyone would, but also exploring some lesser known things about him, but ones that would make perfect sense given his temperament. For instance, his no tolerance for magical bullshit, which is not something the average person would know about Dickens, but would certainly make sense within his portrayal, and yes, he was someone who did revel in exposing charlatan mediums. Secondly, they portray him in a very human way. He's not in his prime, he's old and tired, and we see those years of choices and regrets weighing on him. He's not being portrayed as a historical figure, he's being portrayed as a character, and this helps his character arc work. It's fittingly, and no doubt intentionally, a bit Scroogian. Not quite the same thing, of course, but he's going from being old and tired to rediscovering his passion and zest, which of course makes the tragedy of his death intervening all the worse, but never mind. Talking with a doctor and realising how appreciated he really is seems to be an obvious choice, but only because it was done to death throughout the appearances of the historical figures. Here, it feels fresh and genuinely heartwarming at the end where the doctor tells him how long his works last. It feels earned because the character arc was done so effectively. It's of course helped by a brilliant performance from Simon Callow. Callow is apparently a bit of a Dickens aficionado and has played him many times, so it makes sense he slips into the role perfectly. He hits all the right notes, the bravado, the quiet regret, the joy and satisfaction, and just a hint of that Dickensian whimsy. He really does feel like Dickens himself is on the screen. It is a marvellous performance and I think elevates an already strong character further up from where it is on the page. Also positive is the other main supporting character, Gwyneth, played by Eve Miles. Miles, of course, would later go and play Gwen on Torchwood, which I think was frankly a totally uncalled for punishment. She does very well here and shouldn't have been relegated to such a thing. Gwyneth is in many ways a pretty common archetype, a servant girl who's a lot cleverer than the class system allows her to benefit from, has a tragic backstory, yada yada yada. But it rises above that genericness for a few reasons. Firstly, Miles gives a great performance. That's what I have to say about that. Secondly, the addition of her second sight ability, which in isolation would be very silly, but works very well in both linking the technobabble about the rift to the character work, and also giving it a personal touch. It also gives a bit more to her character as well, something she's trying to live with and work around, and seeing her reactions to it all, it does really flesh her out, and make her seem more than what the archetype suggests. It also allows her to have the relationship she does with the Doctor and Rose, both sympathetic, but despite the efforts of the latter, maybe a little too distant, seeing her as her ability rather than someone who's genuinely in danger until it's too late. Finally, she has a proper character arc, not a huge one, but a small and effective one, her learning the truth behind her faith in these angels or whatever and all that. Overall, it's an effective character. A guest character done right, and who doesn't always manage that, let's be honest, so yeah. Which brings us to our regulars. I won't discuss Eccleston and Piper themselves much, they both do very well, that's all we need to know, but I'll have plenty of other opportunities to talk about their performance, and focus instead on how it ends up on the page. Both have character arcs in this episode, not huge, but they don't need to be, and they end up both being very effective. For Rose, this is still very early in her travels, of course, and this therefore has to be about her learning and growing into TARDIS travel, and the episode takes a simple yet effective route to do so. It focuses on her first real human interaction. Gatiss is someone she can look in the eye, talk to, and realise it's not just a strange being from the far future or a shop window dummy. She's a person like her, and realise how similar and different they can be. The scene where the two of them talk is fantastic. Rose slowly realising that she is facing the realities of her past in front of her, while also realising Gwyneth's experiences, views and feelings are just as shaped by her life and valid as her own are. It's a very nice way to humanise Rose's experience, make it clear to the audience it's about more than just aliens and explosions, and need to make it clear that this is something Rose is learning as she goes along. Now, admittedly, next week it's the fart monsters, and this does undermine it a little bit, but I can hardly hold the crappy next story against this effective one. Rose is also, of course, important to the Doctor's arc in this episode, this one built around morality and guilt from the Time War stuff, obviously. Until the seance scene, the Doctor is taking this in his stride. He's meeting Charles Dickens, investigating an alien menace, he's having the time of his life basically, all until the Gelf mention being decimated by the Time War, and it clearly hits him like a brick. This leads into, as I said, the morality and guilt, whether it's moral to allow the Gelf to inhabit corpses as they seemingly want to. Rose is horrified by the idea, but the Doctor's more open to it, and I like that this is very much a debate between them that remains open-ended. A typical NuWho argument would be one where it obviously meant to take one side, the one Clara is taking if she's around usually, but that's not the case here. The audience is allowed to make up their own mind. Rose might be right that desecrating the bodies of people who had real lives and families and deserve respect in death, no doubt thinking back to her own deceased relative that had been mentioned earlier in the episode, but the Doctor may be right that giving this seemingly peaceful species a second chance is worth more than a few now lifeless bodies. Now, in this argument, I personally would probably side with the Doctor. Actual lives are more important than the lifeless corpses that are being left behind. But I like that the episode gives me that choice, and also make it clear that the Doctor's pronouncement that his morality is like this, and she just needs to accept that, is clearly something coming out of his guilt and perhaps his arrogance, and not something we should immediately accept. It also doesn't become a hideously long argument. It's a few lines, enough for the audience to recognise it, before the Gelf turn out to be the baddies and the entire thing is made moot, but hey, that's fine, the argument had done its job from a storytelling point of view. The Doctor's Time War guilt is of course very prominent throughout this series, and I do like in this episode it leads him to decisions that aren't particularly rational. He does trust the Gelf far too much when they're turning out to be evil as something he should have at least considered a distinct possibility, and this is a deliberate character flaw. The realisation that Rose will die and it's all his fault is a great moment where the audience sees the fallibility of this hero, and it's an important thing to get across so early in the NuWho's run. His attempt to atone for what happened in the war nearly leads to the death of Rose, presumably he would have been able to regenerate, but never mind. And it's only because Charles Dickens suddenly realises gas is the solution that it's averted. I like this a lot. It's not overly complicated, doesn't waste time, but it's effective and builds on the character as it's being developed through the episode. The only issues I have again with the logic of it. The arc gets interrupted because of the silliness with the gas that makes no sense, and also when Rose points out that all the corpses of the world did not start going walkies in 1869, the Doctor tosses off with some waffle about timelines being in flux, they can change, blah blah blah, which... Look, I know Doctor Who's idea of how time works is inconsistent to say the least, but does seem a bit lame and consequence-free, particularly as a few episodes later we'd see what actually fucking with the timeline does. I think a better idea would have been to admit I'll solve that bit later or something, which would add to the idea that he's being driven by his guilt and not necessarily what's logical and makes sense, but overall that's a minor thing. There's a lot else that works about this episode. The dialogue is mostly pretty sharp, for instance. Moffat dialogue this ain't. But the only other thing I actually want to go into detail for is the pacing, which is actually really good. It's the perfect kind of episode for the 45-minute format, and indeed uses it really well. It has a simple premise that requires nothing complex to explain. Everyone is brought together in a tidy and quick yet logical way, and it concentrates on the important stuff while not wasting its time on ridiculous spectacle, for the most part. It's basically paced about as well as it's possible to be for the format, and shows that it can work when you have the right kind of story for it. It also helps, of course, that it doesn't waste time, as I said. No doubt if Moffat were writing the chase between the horse cabs, it would have been a huge set piece that wasted time that could have been used for the character work for no other reasons than to have fast, shiny things on screen. But instead in this episode, it's just a backdrop to other things happening. A conversation between the Doctor and Dickens, establishing character, using the time wisely. It's quite smart in how it's structured like that, and it's a bit sad that NuWho as a whole as an average where competent structure is considered praiseworthy, but oh well. I think it's excellently paced, and overall that helps all the other elements come together. So, considering this is Halloween, is this a creepy episode? Not really. As I said, the monsters let it down when they're ineffective presence, and the walking zombies are just really silly. And it doesn't have enough atmosphere to make up for it, so it has some of the surface trappings of a creepy episode. I don't think it actually manages to achieve that. Again, on that surface, it is kind of like a homage to the Hinchcliffe era, but it doesn't have the effectiveness that era had. Doctor Who can be very creepy and unnerving, providing you fully commit, and make sure the real stakes behind it are well portrayed, and that there's depth to the actions involved. Just a pure surface aesthetic isn't enough. Which admittedly makes it an anticlimax for Halloween, but other than that, the logical and the illogical issues I mentioned, is mostly a pretty good episode. Strong characters, great pacing and structure, solid central idea, and for the most part decent plotting, which only really falls down in the ending. It's an enjoyable episode which for the most part gets it right. It's a standard filler episode of NuWho done properly, and considering it's from both a writer and director I'm overall not hugely impressed with most of the time, I think that's something to be appreciated. Not the creepiest or indeed most Halloweeny episode of Doctor Who, but certainly a good one, and with NuWho you take that sometimes. So bearing in mind the final score is a measure of how this episode compares to all other NuWho episodes, I'm awarding the Unquiet there the score as 7 out of 10. It's a good episode, which excels with its pacing and character work and gives us an interesting and executed story. It's not perfect, but its flaws are relatively forgivable given the strength for things that NuWho so often gets wrong, and therefore I'm grateful that when they are something that's done right, even if not everything else is. I sat down, I watched it, I enjoyed it, I came away without it feeling a bitter anger and annoyance, which is better than NuWho manages particularly often, so who am I to complain?